In the 6th century, Venantius Fortunatus wrote the hymn, Salve Festa Days, Hail, O festive days. And in that hymn, he calls on all creation to rejoice in the fact of the resurrection. Welcome, happy morning. Age to age they'll say, hell today is vanquished, heaven is won today. Lo, the dead is rising, God forevermore. Him, their true creator, all his works adore. Welcome, happy morning. Age to age shall say. Okay, I'm just about out of coffee and it's getting cold out here. So let's head back to the house and get this video done. Good morning. My name is David Paris, and I've been teaching graduate level theological studies and doing research for the past 30 years. And in this channel, what I hope to do is bring you along on that journey a little bit in this process of discovery, looking at the biblical texts and why these texts are so amazing in a variety of ways. So if you like the channel, be sure to subscribe to it and then also share it so that other people know about it. Now, last week, we looked at the start, or the first half of John chapter 20, in particular the story of Mary Magdalene and her encounter with the risen Lord at the tomb. This week, we're going to continue on in John chapter 20 and look at the succeeding stories to that, namely the appearance to the disciples in the upper room. And a lot of the themes that were introduced with Mary Magdalene are going to carry over into this week as well. So if you need, I've included a link here to the video from last week. What's interesting is that John does not tell us at all of the impact that Mary's story had with the disciples. All it tells us is that she went and she reported to them, and then he drops the story there. And the next thing we see is that the disciples are in the upper room. So did they believe her? Did they doubt her? Did they reject her message? We don't know. The other thing is that Mary's story begins when it's dark and it's the beginning of day. Now we pick up the story and John tells us that it's approaching evening. Darkness is coming again. So you can wonder, if Mary gave this report in the morning, what have they been talking about? What have they been doing all day in this room? Now verse 19 opens with the disciples. They're gathered in a room and they're locked inside, probably with one of those sliding bars that would go across from one door into the door jamb or slide into a slot in the other door. And the reason why they're locked in is because they fear the Jewish leadership. One of the things about crucifixion that was so important to understand during the Roman period, this was meant to execute him in the most publicly shameful and humiliating and painful way possible, so that all of his followers would then see this and know that we don't go down that path. We don't keep adhering to what he was teaching and what he was advocating. Now, the second thing we can notice if we take a look at the text here is that the disciples are all gathered in this room. And John just says the disciples. Now, it's very easy to read this as just the 10 disciples or the 10 apostles. But Mary and some other women were considered disciples of Jesus. In the road to Emmaus appearance, you have Cleopas, who's Jesus' uncle, on the road there, and he's called one of the disciples. So in the Gospels, one of the things to realize is that Jesus has followers, which could be a very large group of people. Then he has disciples, which we know include up to at least 70 people. Remember in Matthew's Gospel, he sends the 70 out in pairs of 2 to preach the message. And then you have this inner core, the 12 apostles. And even among the 12 apostles, we have 3 among them, Peter, James, and John, that get special attention. So you sort of have this rippling out effect of these different groups. So who are the disciples then that John is talking about here? Well, he doesn't fill us in on this. Minimum, the 10 people, because you've got Thomas who's not there and Judas has killed himself. So minimum 10. And it could possibly be larger than that. I could easily see this going up to maybe 20 or 30 people as well. And then we get these really startling words here. It says that Jesus appeared to them. Now here you are in this locked room and suddenly Jesus appears. And this is a lot like the story of Mary Magdalene out at the tomb. She's looking for the body of Jesus and all of a sudden Jesus just kind of appears and she thinks he's a gardener until he calls her name. Now look what Jesus says when he appears to them. He says, "Peace be with you." Now we always like to, theologize about this and everything, but this is a very common greeting throughout the Middle East, especially in the ancient world, and it is even to this day. This isn't just a lack of conflict, that you and I are no longer in conflict with each other. Rather, peace conveys the idea of being in a good relationship with other people, to being in the right relationship with in your community. Security, well-being, safety, all these ideas go into it. So it's a much larger and broader term. Now this idea of peace be with you is a dominant theme in this particular story. The other big dominant theme that we see repeated are the wounds that Jesus has on his body. He's going to show them to the disciples the first time, and then when Thomas shows up, he's going to invite him to actually place his fingers within the wounds. Teaches us two things. One is that there is identity between the physical Jesus that lived on the earth and then the resurrected Jesus that comes. But there is also discontinuity, because Jesus is not suffering pain, nor is he in a life-threatening situation because of these wounds. They just seem to be holes. And also the fact that he appears and disappears out of rooms tells us something also. This is not something that a physical body does. So there is identity or continuity between Jesus' physical existence on earth before the resurrection and his resurrected state of being. There is also discontinuity. The resurrected body is different in a number of ways to the physical body that he had once before. And Paul talks about this at great length in 1 Corinthians 15. And then in verse 21, Jesus reiterates his blessing of peace be with you. But this time he adds, "As the Father sent me, so I am sending you." Now in John's gospel, this theme that Jesus has been sent by the Father to redeem the world, John 3:16, for God gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life, is one of the main themes that comes throughout his whole gospel. Now notice the resurrection brings this great message of hope, but it also brings a great message of challenge. Jesus now says to those who follow him, "As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." The church is a sent organization. The apostles are sent people. And this commission is being given here as well. Just as with Mary we saw, "I am going to my Father and your Father, I am going to my God and your God," now we have a parallel but a slightly different take on that with "just as the Father sent me, so I am sending you." And it's almost like we could take what Jesus said to Mary and what Jesus says to the apostles, chop everything out and put the two together. "I am going to my Father and your Father. I am going to my God and your God. And just as the Father sent me, so I am sending you." Now we come to this really interesting verse, verse 22, where Jesus looks at them and he breathes upon them. Now, in the New Testament, this is the only place where this Greek word is used. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and I'm going to show you where this word infusio comes from. You'll notice that it's used a total of 8 times in the Bible. And in particular, the texts that we're very interested in are the ones where it's talking about one person blowing in or blowing into another person. And these are found at 3 places. Genesis chapter 2, Ezekiel 37, and John chapter 20. And you kind of go, this sounds like you're going a little bit back to the Ezekiel 37 video. But remember in Genesis chapter 2, God formed man out of clay. So you've got this clay man standing there, Adam. And then God breathes into him and he becomes a living person, Adam. God's breath comes into it. And in the Greek, when they translate the Hebrew into the Greek here, they use this verb, infusio. God's breath brings life. And in the Old and the New Testaments, it's when this breath of life comes into an individual at birth, or on the other end, when the breath leaves them, where we get the Latin expire, to breathe out. That is when life begins and ends. So Adam becomes a living creature when God breathes into him. Then we go to Ezekiel's vision. Remember, he's out there in that incredibly horrific scene of all those dead bones. And then God tells him to prophesy, and he does. And all these bones begin to hook together and link, and sinew and muscle and joints and everything forms. And now you have all of these dead bodies. And in Ezekiel 37:9, it says, prophesy to the breath. Prophecy, O son of man, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on or breathe into these slain that they may live. And it's when this wind, this breath of God comes into them that they come back to life again. Now, what's going on here in John chapter 20? Remember, if we go back to John chapter 3 in the story of Nicodemus, Jesus turns to Nicodemus and he says, you must be born again. Nicodemus says, how can an old man climb back into his mother's womb? And Jesus says, no, you must be born of the water and you must be born of the Spirit, pneuma. And then he talks about how this breath or this wind blows. You hear where it comes from, but you don't know where it is going. This is what it means to be born of God. It's this breath, this wind, this Spirit that comes in. So in John chapter 20, when Jesus approaches them and he breathes on them, you get this picture of the disciples are like the clay man, Ha-Adam in Genesis 2, or these dead people in Ezekiel 37. And Jesus is breathing on them and they're going to have new life. What he talked about with Nicodemus is now going to happen with them. But as a result, this wind of God, this breath of God, this Spirit, the pneuma that comes into them when Jesus breathes on them, is a commissioning. And just like he said with Nicodemus, you know where it comes from. Yeah, Jesus breathes on them. The key thing is they don't know where it's going to go. And so you look at these, let's say 10 men up to maybe 30 people in the room there, and what they are going to do over the next 20 to 40 years and where they're going to end up, it's going to be absolutely phenomenal. It's like the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places That You Will Go. You have no idea at all where the Spirit of God is going to blow you, and that's the great adventure of the Christian life. Where is the Spirit of God going to lead me? What is he going to ask me to do? And how do I set my sails to allow this wind to blow me through life? Now, this statement where Jesus says, if you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven, or if you bind anyone's or retain anyone's sins, they are retained, can be interpreted two ways. The first way is to read it in light of Matthew, especially Matthew 16. I'll put the verses here. Basically, that Christ is giving authority to the apostles to either exercise sort of divine forgiveness. The second way is to read it in light of John's gospel, but also his epistles. So in 1 John 1:9, we get this statement. If anyone confesses their sin, he is faithful and just to forgive them their sins and cleanse them of all unrighteousness. Now in John's gospel and in his letters, the view regarding forgiveness is very much based upon whether a person confesses that to God or not. So according to the second reading then, tell people that if they confess their sins, they are forgiven. It's an apostolic message about this. In verses 24 through 28, now the story changes a little bit. We've had the story of Mary Magdalene at the tomb. Then we get the disciples in the room, but Thomas is missing. And then 24 through 28, we get the story of doubting Thomas. If you were writing in the ancient world and you wanted to convince people about the veracity of the resurrection, there's a number of things you wouldn't do. The first thing you wouldn't do is you wouldn't base the story on the testimony of women. If you wanted to convince people that Jesus rose from the dead, you don't include a story where one of his key followers is, wait a second, guys, I don't know what you've been smoking in this room and whether it's legal or not, but you're nuts. Unless I see and put my hands on his side, I am not going to believe. Dead people don't come back from the grave. I think John includes this because he lets us see just how difficult it is to believe in the resurrection, and that there is a real struggle that a person needs to overcome in accepting this as the message of salvation. Now in verse 29, at the end of Jesus' encounter with Thomas, you get this statement from Jesus where he says, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." Now I went into this with Mary Magdalene. Our faith is based upon hearing the word and responding to the message that God gives us of forgiveness. And so we get that here. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. Now we come to verses 30 and 31. And this is one of these really interesting passages because at this point, John leaves the narration of the text and jumps out to tell us something. Then in verse 31, he says, "But these are recorded that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you might have life in his name." This is one of those passages a lot like the movie Princess Bride, where the grandfather comes to read a book to his grandson.
She doesn't get eaten by the eels at this time.
What?
The eel doesn't get her. I'm explaining to you because you look nervous.
I wasn't nervous. Well, maybe I was a little bit concerned, but that's not the same thing.
Because we can stop now if you want.
No, you could read a little bit more if you want.
Here, as John's going along, he breaks his narration and he engages us 2,000 years later as readers. In other words, it's like he stops his story, he's writing over here, and he turns to us and he goes, I want you to know, I'm writing these things to you so that you might believe and you might have life in his name. In other words, he drops out of the narrative to address us as the reader directly. Now, I sure hope this quick exploration of John chapter 20 helps give you some context or a new way to look at our situation here today and what God might be asking of you. The other thing I want to say is I've been showing you the software I've been using, and Accordance Software, the company that publishes this, has got a sale on their introductory package right now. Until May 4th, they're offering 50% off on their software. I will include a link below the video that will take you to their website. I don't get any money. I'm not sponsored to do this. There's no kickback or anything like that, but this is a phenomenal deal, and it's a great entry package. And let me close with Jesus' statement from this passage. The peace of the Lord be with you.